Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Innovation Storytellers Show. Today, we are going to take a trip on the high seas. Today, we are going to be talking with the United States Navy about all things innovation. And that's why I'm so excited that my guest, Scott Walper, is joining me. He is the Science Director for Synthetic Biology for the U.S. Office of Naval Research Global, where he works to support innovative foundational science and technology around the world. Dr. Walper obtained his PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi in chemistry in 2010 and joined NRL as a National Research Council postdoctoral fellow in the same year. So you may not know that we have federal scientists working for us every day in the armed forces. But he is a federal scientist who has led and contributed to a number of really important research programs in synthetic biology, including engineering bacteria for bioremediation, biomaterials for flexible electronics, and designing a microbial sentinel for pathogen detection. This is all amazing stuff that we're going to get into at the layman level that I'm excited about. But in addition to these, Dr. Walper maintains research programs exploiting cell-free systems for building in vitro enzymatic cascades for biosynthesis of chemical precursors. Now, that last part, I'm going to have to get a bit of an explanation, Dr. Walper.
Well, I tell you what, we'll try to keep it non-technical because we often wander down that hole a little too quickly when we talk about engineered biology and synthetic biology. So we'll try to bring it back down to earth to make it a bit easier for everyone to understand. Because while it is remarkable science, what we're targeting here is simplicity, right? And finding biology and leveraging the tools that biology uses to make the things we need for everyday life, right? So how do we get
And for
away from
extraordinary life too, right? I
Yes,
mean, for
yes.
extraordinary parts of our lives, that in the military. So start us off first, Scott. How does a biologist wind up getting into the Navy? How did these two paths wind up crossing?
It's accidental, of course, as are most things in life, right? Complete accident. So I actually worked towards sensor development in graduate school in recombinant antibodies. So,
Okay.
of course, antibodies being those molecules in your body that bind all of the nasty things that we encounter on a daily basis, whether that's a virus or a bacteria or something you shouldn't have eaten today, which I'm always too guilty of. So in graduate school, I worked on developing new platforms for that. So not a normal antibody, but a small antibody that you could take out of a living thing and use in a sensor to detect something in the field. Specifically, we were looking for agricultural pathogens. When I was in grad school, we had that wonderful E. coli outbreak that came across the border in tomatoes and chilies from Mexico and Central America. And so my grant revolved around developing tools to detect those pathogens in the products that we eat. But it just so happened that there was a researcher at the Navy who was doing very similar work, not for agricultural pathogens, but she was very heavily invested in developing new antibody scaffolds. So new ways to take antibodies and make them detect specific targets and then integrate it into sensors, right? Whether it was a quick diagnostic, like we see with the lateral flow assays that we're all familiar with COVID, right? Where you get the nice little purple line if you're sick, or two purple lines if you're sick, one line if
Two
you're healthy.
purple lines. Yes, sir.
Two purple lines. Uh, but she and I happened upon each other at a meeting in Las Vegas, of all places. And I guess through serendipity, the stars, however you want to look at it, she called me my last year of graduate school and said, I need somebody to come and work on this project. Are you ready to graduate? And I had never heard of the Naval Research Laboratory before that. I too thought the Navy was just ships, missiles, sailors, and submarines. But that is an inaccurate representation of the US Navy.
Mm.
And so I did take her up on her offer. I moved to Washington, D.C. from Mississippi and started my career as a Navy scientist, doing all sorts of fascinating research. Of course, starting with recombinant antibodies, but then branching off into all sorts of different fields in engineered biology. As you mentioned, the synthetic biology, the bioremediation, and the like. If I can say one thing to the listeners, it's like you have to understand that the US Navy is incredibly exploratory. We're one of the few branches of the service that touch every environment, right? So of course we're the Navy, and we're on the high seas and we're under the high seas, but we're also in space. We have a strong space program. We're in the air with all of the airplanes and helicopters we fly, and we support the Marine Corps. So we're boots on the ground in the desert, in the jungles and the swamps and the like. So the Navy really has exploratory research programs that span everything, every type of environment, every technology you can think of. The Navy is actively exploring in some way, shape, or form.
Well, which is just fascinating, right? Because we don't necessarily think of the deployment of science in the protection of the safety and security of our armed forces and the homeland. And yet we need scientists to protect the armed forces themselves as well as our civilian populations as a matter of national security.
We do, we do. This is very true. And it is often difficult to convince people who are not scientists, of course, uniformed leaders, as well as people in Congress, that science is important because science is expensive, as we all know. But it is a challenge to tell people that everything you do, everything you wear, have, use, eat, came from some scientific discovery or exploitation, right? All of the textiles we wear, I mean, with the exception of cotton, of course, but most of the polymers we wear, it's a science project,
Mhm.
right? The computers we use are science projects. All of them in the Navy, all of the missiles, the ballistics, the tracking systems, all of the cool toys they have and employ. It was some scientist's vision, scientist and engineer. It was their vision and then their goal to make that vision come true, right? So everything that works came from some scientific discovery, right?
Scott,
Um,
can you talk a little bit about the culture of innovation, like where these two things overlap? I think some people think of innovation as mad scientists kind of running around with test tubes and coming up some cool new concoction like in a
of
cartoon.
course.
But the military is typically a very regimented place, and scientific method can and cannot be following that kind of very particular
Yes.
regimented life. What's the innovation culture in the Navy?
So we're very lucky in the Navy because I engage in my day-to-day life with
Uh,
Global, with academics. We're very lucky in the Navy that there are tiered levels of development.
uh,
So anyone who does innovation, technology development knows of the valley of death, right? Where you have this great science, this technology, you've taken it from the BevNap type idea to the I've tested it, I have a proof of concept demo that I can hold in my hand, but now I need to scale up, develop, and the like. And there's this huge valley where you have to get money, where you have to get support to go from what you can hold in your hand to that thing you can see in the air, on the sea, or the like, or even on your grocery shelf or in Walmart, whatever the case may be. And so the Valley of Death is very tricky to navigate. So within the Navy and the Department of Defense in general, while we're not perfect, we do have a lot of tools in place to bridge that valley. And so innovation is well supported in the Navy and the Department of Defense through these individual institutions and structures that are designed to carry research from its inception to its testing to its development and deployment. So what I do now is the very early stage research, right? I love my job. I go around to academics and to startup companies and I'm like, tell me your crazy idea. What's the craziest thing you can come up with that you can't get any money for? But the other part of my job, once I find those ideas, is to say, okay, you show me that it works. And I'm going to find someone that's going to help you with that innovation and carry it forward. And so the Navy has a lot of programs in place that will help move research and innovation along and offer support as it moves forward. And not always with the platform developments that most people think of with the US Navy, but often at the very early stage research with we recognize these key technologies and these key developments, and we want to foster those ideas because we don't know where it'll go, right? And that's one of the things you get with the Department of Defense, where you often don't get with other funding agencies, is they're very willing to invest in science and technology, even though they're not sure where it will go. And the
mhm.
Navy has a long history and lineage of that, where we invest in things early on just because we don't understand the science and we don't like not knowing, right?
And we don't necessarily want the enemy to find out before us
Yeah.
either,
Well, I
right?
was going to skirt that one, but we have a term for that. And I mean, of course, you hear it in Congress and you hear it in the military circles where they say, we want to prevent technological surprise, right? You never
Technological surprise. That sounds like some kind of Jello recipe that's going to get
kind
wheeled
of,
at
right?
Christmas.
Kind of. But you never want to see someone show up to the playground with a better glove or baseball bat than you have, right? You always want to be the kid with the shiny new toy, right? And I mean, biology works that way. Of course, I think with the biology mind, right? I mean, the guy with the best, or the animal with the best kit is the one that survives and thrives. I mean, it's Darwin's evolution, right? That's just the way
Right.
it works. And so the Department of Defense and the leaders have always recognized that.
What's
Uh,
the shift, Scott, from commercialization? Like I think of monies being spent at the NIH, at the National Institutes of Health, where we're developing all different kinds of what in the commercial life we would call pre-seed or seed stage, idea stage. We incubate ideas around health. But in the Navy, are you starting off at that extreme early stage with the idea that the technologies that you develop will go on to serve the Navy? Or are we starting off early stage with the idea of commercializing it and spinning it out to a third party entity?
So very seldom is it with the idea of spinning it out to a third party entity. Now, I will say, coming from the Naval Research Laboratory, that we are encouraged, of course, to publish, to patent, to make scientific knowledge publicly available because we recognize that's how science moves forward, right? I might have a great idea, but someone's going to build upon that idea for the next great discovery, right?
Mm.
And so the Navy openly encourages the sharing of knowledge and information within limits, of course, right? I mean, we do know that some things are classified. There's a whole classification system. But when they undertake a project, we always have the Navy, the warfighter in mind, even if it's very far off, right?
Mhm.
My job as program manager now is to see very far off and say that what I'm funding today in engineered biology is going to have an impact in ship performance 20 years down the road if all of these things line up. But it's the same across the Navy and across the Department of Defense. Is you'll have some researcher who says, I don't understand this phenomenon, why this material is behaving in this way, and I want money to fund it. And then because scientists and innovators and engineers are creative people, we say, if you give me the money now, in 20 years, you'll get this, maybe, if it all works according to plan. But the Navy has money to invest in those early exploratory ideas, right? One of the things that I encounter, because I work for O&R Global now, so all of my business is done internationally. I don't fund anybody in the US. I only fund people overseas. And I
Okay.
often get asked the question of why the US Navy is here and what do you get out, right? And what we get out of it, of course, is advancing the field forward and enabling people to be successful themselves, right? So the Navy, O&R, does this in the US and O&R Global does it internationally. We don't look to commercialize, we don't look to develop, but we want you to do it, right? We want someone else to be successful to have that product that we need, that we want, so that you can then sell it to us. Okay. I often make the joke that the US military, we don't build anything, right? We buy the chips, the materials, the fabrics that someone else makes, and then we put it together for our own needs. And so when people ask us about that, the money that I have is for you to be successful, to help you with your innovation, to help you build that company. And we want to support you along the way. But in the end, the Navy doesn't take ownership of anything. We always just want someone else to make the products for us so we can buy it from them downstream, if
Got
all
it.
of that makes sense.
So the investment is in the discovery.
Always in the discovery.
Yeah.
We do have, the US Navy does have facilities, of course, that are very Navy focused, right? Spread out across the US that develop the tools and the kits and take things to the more advanced level, right?
Hmm.
So when you do see the cool pictures of you're watching Top Gun Maverick or whatever, and you see the plane landing on the aircraft carrier and catching the hook and the drag line. I mean, all of that, of course, is developed with Navy specific applications in mind at naval surface warfare centers, same as the missiles and the targeting systems and the like. But the foundational technologies that go into building that capability were done somewhere else for the most part. Some academic, some research laboratory developed that, licensed it to the US, or sold a product to the US Navy, who then bought it, integrated it, used it.
When you think about your work, do you think about yourself as like a tech scout? that you're kind of combing through Europe going, show me your cool new stuff?
I do.
Yeah.
I am a bit of a tech scout and a cheerleader. I'm a cheerleader for sure.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, you find with very early stage scientists and engineers, and more so in Europe than in the US, even though the US is challenging, that it's very hard to get that little bit of praise and that little bit of capital to get started. Right?
Hmm.
Scientists and engineers, we're creative creatures, we're artists. We have these insane ideas that wake us up in the middle of the night. And I know this coming from my own laboratory and having tons of crazy ideas that nobody would give me money for. But oftentimes, you find the scientist who has this crazy idea and he just doesn't have anybody who will back him enough to get started. And it's pervasive, right? It's not just in science, and it's with startup companies, it's with any sort of innovation development. It's the, what is it, the three deaths that every technology suffers through, where you can't get anyone to buy in and believe in your technology in the very early stages of development. So yes, my job now is very much as a tech scout to find that researcher with the crazy idea that no one else will back and say, you know what, I think that could be useful to the US, to the US Navy. Let's see how we can move that forward. And of course, I have dollars of my own that I'll invest in it. But when I say cheerleader, what I really do is I understand those difficulties that scientists can encounter. And as I fund a project, it's really my job to take it around and put it in front of the next funder and say, have you seen this technology coming out of Spain? Great, it's remarkable. And in a few years, it's going to be really exciting. Do you want to buy in? Because that's very challenging for especially someone in an academic setting. I mean, industry people hire people like me to do that for their business, right? To go around and take their technology and sell it because it's a critical shortcoming and challenge for everybody as they take their technology from its inception to a commercial product. Finding that next investor, finding that next buyer. And that's a big part of my job at O&R Global. It's very different than what I did in the laboratory, but salesmanship is definitely a part of science and technology development, right? We
Yes,
try.
as in storytelling, right? So,
Yeah.
and so I'm curious when you identify a technology, right? So maybe share with us a little bit, Scott, about your process, because I think this is like we're really pulling back a curtain on how our armed forces innovate. Because I think there's a lot of conjecture like, oh, we're still flying planes from, or those planes that don't work, we're still funding, or that this idea of our armed forces being at the cutting edge of innovation and the criteria that we use to fund that and to find it. Can you pull back the curtain
Oh,
a little
definitely,
bit how you do
definitely.
that?
Yeah. And you do have to keep it in mind. I mean, I cannot rattle off the figure off the top of my head, and probably thankfully so. But you have to remember the Department of Defense is a huge machine, right? I mean, they get so many billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars every year.
Trillions,
I mean,
maybe?
yeah. Yeah. And a lot of that does go into what everybody is familiar with, right? Keeping the 20-year-old planes, the 50-year-old ships, the subs running and going. And that does cost a lot of money, and a lot of technology goes into baby step improvements in making those machines better and more functional. But the Navy, and almost certainly the whole of the Department of Defense, realizes that, again, we want to prevent technological surprise, that you have to invest in the very exploratory research, right? Because that's where the exciting discovery comes from and the new toys come from, is investing in the early stage stuff and just seeing where it will go. And so the US Navy has a dollar amount that they put towards science and technology development every year. So ONR Global, they're ONR Global and ONR, so the Office of Naval Research and the Office of Naval Research Global is the funding agencies for the US Navy. They look for basic science and early stage applied science at all levels in the US and internationally. And I think their budget's around $2.5 billion a year, right? That they invest in projects at every stage. A lot of that is very basic science, what we refer to as 6-1 science. Every
What is
program.
that 6-1 science? What does that mean?
So 6-1 science, it's an acquisition, government acquisition thing. And so the spectrum runs from 6-1, which is very basic science, exploratory science, all the way up to 6-7, 6-9, which is where you think about putting hardware together and putting it on something. And so they fund at every level of that. So when you see the Navy ship in the airplane, that's far end of the spectrum. But where we exist and where we fund primarily at O&R Global, and my role is in the 6-1 science. So it's where a scientist has an idea, maybe he has a little preliminary data, but mostly it's, I saw this thing and I think I can do it. That's where we like to invest. For me in synthetic biology, right? It's, I think I can take, I think I can grow these fungal biomaterials that will have these properties, or I think I can engineer this organism to produce this compound that will be useful for decontamination, or engineer a sensor that lets you know when you have a non endemic organism that you're going to dump into a new environment. Because these are all concerns that we deal with, right? A Navy ship goes from port A to point B, or port A to port B, and you want to make sure that you're not releasing an invasive species. So how do you detect that?
Plus, yeah.
I mean, these are all things that we look at in the
Right.
Navy that people don't ever think about, right? But these are day-to-day issues that we encounter, right? Case in point, the Navy has battled macro fouling, right? Barnacle development on Navy ships for as long as Navy ships have been around, right? And we've invested in good technology, we've invested in bad technology, but we continue to explore new technologies throughout, right? And we
By
invest
the
basically.
way,
Oh, go
I
ahead.
I was watching CBS Sunday Morning just this weekend, and apparently barnacles are the latest raged in tinned fish and tinned seafood. So barnacles are becoming the new hipster delicacy.
Really?
If you are looking for new applications of the barnacle, you may wind up finding it in the mess hall rather than
Yeah.
some kind of deterrent to Navy expediency.
Maybe the Navy can make a few dollars. I mean, we have a lot of ships out there.
And you
It's
got a
part
lot of
of
barnacles.
farming. I know. Find a way to repurpose it.
There you
Uh,
go.
yeah, I'll have to look into that. That's very interesting.
It's fascinating too, because I'm curious where you source some of these ideas from. I often invite the winners of the MIT top 30, like those who are really coming up with great discoveries or fast companies, most innovative companies, to come on the show and tell us about their cool innovation and the stories that they had to tell their professors to get the thumbs up for the green light for the grant. And
Yeah.
I'll try to include it in the show notes, which episode it was, but there was a PhD student at MIT who had developed a pill that you would swallow that would self-inject insulin into the wall of the stomach,
Oh, very
and
nice.
copied the self-righting mechanism of a South African sea turtle. Because no matter how this turtle flipped around, it always came back to center gravity. It always found its way back to right itself. And so this hexagonal shaped pill that you would swallow would know exactly when and where in the digestive process to inject you with the right amount of insulin with your meal. And then you would just flush it away. And so these kind of zoological and biological crossovers into, I mean, the hundreds of mechanisms that went into that process, right? It's not just, okay, now I swallow, now I'm digesting. That's a biochemical process, right? Now I'm creating a little motorized syringe that comes out at my stomach lining. Like, these are the things that I'm hearing about on the show from what's happening at the university level. Are you encountering stuff that feels that mind-blowingly kooky almost, or really
Most
out there?
definitely. Most
Wow, how
definitely.
fun.
And because without, you hate to divulge too much, but I've seen the crazy science. There was a great one I saw recently when I was in Italy where they were working on a 3D printer robot arm sort of device for repairing wounds, essentially. He was talking about printing bone and tissue material where you would just put a robot arm and it would just fill in the damage as you went, which I thought was, I mean, we've seen that in science fiction movies for 20 years. And so it's great to see that someone said, I think I can do that. And the tools are developing so quickly
Mhm.
that we won't even recognize the things we have in the next 20 years, right? I mean, we don't now. I mean, you think about the iPhone and the iPad and the technology we have now. Who would have thought when I was a kid that I would have all of the knowledge in the world available in a smartphone?
And we wonder why we're not sleeping. Of course,
Yeah,
I
I
want
know.
to ingest all the knowledge of the world prior to sleeping,
Exactly.
but I wind up watching scary episodes of Law and Order because murder and mayhem are exactly what I need just as I'm dozing
Yes.
off.
Yes,
But
exactly.
but there are other, it's one thing to identify these technologies, it's another thing to kind of look at your own portfolio of what your investments are, right?
Definitely.
And
Yeah.
those targets and the strategies that you're creating, which you may or may not be able to share with us. But what is the story that you need to tell Congress? All of my listeners have to go before the board or go before their chief innovation officer and talk about why they want funding for this project. What is your process like in actually getting funding for these amazing ideas? What are the stories that you need to tell, Scott? And maybe you can share some examples.
No, and so what you say in the basis of your podcast is very true, right? So, and I'm going to take it a step back beforehand, but I know you wouldn't believe it by the amount of stuff that comes out of my mouth based on our two conversations and how freely I talk. But I used to be a very shy person and have a hard time communicating. But I learned that was not very productive.
Mm,
And when I had postdocs in my laboratory, I would always tell them that as a scientist, you have to be a used car salesman, right? You have to recognize a person's need and you have to sell them your product, right? No matter what it is, even if it's not what they need, you have to sell them that. And so, even in the Navy and in science and technology, and as O&R Global as a program officer, the idea of telling a story or creating a narrative is critical to getting your idea forward, right? I mean, you could have the greatest science, but if you don't make it applicable to your audience and make them feel as though they can't live without that, or at the very minimum that they desperately need that, then it's never going to go anywhere. So even with the crazy science fiction stuff that I like to fund in my portfolio, I still go to my leadership and say, imagine if you will, or we see this gap and this shortfall, and I have this technology that's going to answer that. Maybe not today, but if we lay the foundation for this and we enable this technology and we nurture this development, this is the path that will lead us on. You really do have to create that narrative in order to move science and technology forward, no matter how great it is. Mostly because the people that you're talking to don't understand what you're talking about, right?
that's right. Right. I mean, just reading your bio alone, right, is a
I know my
challenge.
bio is terrible. I'm sorry.
But I mean, but it is that kind of science that's so absolutely critical to our survival as the armed forces, and also, but making it understood so that a congressperson can go back and talk about to their constituencies,
Yes.
whether it's internal in the government or within members of certain committees, or actually just going back to those who elected them and say, your tax dollars are really at the cutting edge of what it takes to protect
Oh,
the
yeah.
homeland.
And it is. And science does get a bad rap, right? Because it does confuse people. And then if you don't really understand it, the knee-jerk reaction is just to say, ooh, bad, don't touch it, right? And so you get a lot of that from people. And so that's why there needs to be more people, right, who have that ability to translate science to a basic level, right? And it's critical for scientists and engineers to find that person, if they can't do it themselves, who can communicate their idea to the masses, right? I've met brilliant scientists who just can't dumb it down,
Mm,
right? I mean, there's a reason that AI describes things as, and then it goes into the black box, and the machine crunches it around in the black box and spits it out. It's because the black box is incredibly complicated, right? And so they try to put this very vague descriptor to it to make it accessible to the masses. And sometimes that works. And then sometimes it just leaves people going, I don't like it and I don't want to touch it because it's confusing.
right. But maybe it's also helpful just thinking about it. If you're in a similar situation, if you're listening to this conversation and feeling, wow, I have some amazing science, I either A, refuse to dumb it down because the science is so darn cool, right? We have certainly those folks who stay in the,
Yes.
I
Yes.
refuse to dumb it down. And I prefer to use the phrase, as you mentioned, make it accessible. I don't want to lose any of the science when I'm doing innovation storytelling. I want to make it just as exciting for the listener as it is for me.
Yes.
And so the key for all of you listening, the key to doing that is asking yourself, how am I creating goodwill in the world? And the reason why that question is so imperative when we're talking about innovation is because just like a songwriter, you probably don't write it for yourself. It's not just looking at a chemical formulation or a reaction taking place in a lab and saying, wow, I really hope it stays here, right here in this little petri dish, and it never leaves it, right under my watchful eye. Chances are that's not your intention. If you can zoom out for a heartbeat and say, how am I making someone else's life better as a result of this breakthrough? And it really is the fundamental question. How am I making somebody else's life better? If you can answer that question, you can work yourself backwards from the science and say, oh, let me tell you why it makes someone's life better. And the reason why that particular question is critical for those of us in innovation is because we need other people, to your point, to share the story for us. We don't have to be the best storyteller in the world. In fact, stories that are shared by others after they hear us telling it are more trustworthy, are more valuable, and receive more investment if someone else can infuse their own benefit into the breakthrough rather than just hearing the breakthrough alone. So it's more believable if someone else goes, oh my gosh, I get it. And here's how it would impact me. Now I tell two friends and so on, because innovation storytelling requires movement and momentum for an idea to keep traveling and for people to say yes. So answer for yourself that question, and all of our breakthroughs, how am I making someone else's life better? When they become the hero, then your technology really has an opportunity to proliferate. But without that, it just gets stuck in a petri dish.
Yes, definitely. And as you kind of allude to, right, that second carrier of your story, right, in the telephone, the game of telephone, right, he's going to know how to speak, he or she is going to know how to speak to his target audience. And that's
That's right.
going to change everywhere you go. And so you want to inspire, it's a ring, right, or a series of circles. You want to inspire the next ring, who's going to inspire the next ring. And the language may change, but you want the benefit, the story, to be consistent, the messaging, right? And that's key. And like you said, you do need to identify what is the value. The science is super cool, right? But you have to have the grand vision, the sell, if you will, or how it's going to benefit in mind when you start to kind of frame things up.
That's right.
I do love the details. And I tell you what, I will sit down with a molecular biologist all day long and talk about pathway engineering and protein interaction, but I would never talk to my captain in that language, right?
Right.
That's
It's a different language, to your point. It's a different language. And we wouldn't go to China and expect to speak Swahili and be understood. Right.
exactly.
I mean, so for all of you out there who have these breakthrough ideas and really frustrated that it's not moving, you move your center of gravity from what you built, what you discovered, until to the recipient, because that's what changes. We never hear about the iPhone camera having 10,000 individual parts and 4 individual cables that are 1/10 the width of a human hair that suspends that lens inside the case. We know that it takes amazing pictures that create memories for a lifetime for the user, right?
Mhm.
That's what we're buying. We're not buying 10,000 individual parts.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. And sometimes you do just have to take that step back, right?
you do. Zoom out, people, zoom out.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Who could be
It,
interested?
and I always use the examples of the prophets. The prophets spoke to us in parables so that we could understand in generalizations what is the lesson to be learned from the concept, from the idea, from the breakthrough. And then 12 happy friends who heard the same story wound up retelling those stories differently from their own human perspective. And when they shared those stories, the listener then incorporates their own personal experience. And that's why thousands of years later, we're still telling those stories, is because they impact us differently. And we take into account what the listener needs, not just our own experience of it. So take a page from a prophet. If you want to be an innovation prophet, think about your listener before you think about your breakthrough.
Definitely. Definitely.
So, Scott, what could we foresee? Can you give us like a little sneak peek of some of the things that maybe you're working on? And I know there's even like cross-siloed, cross-armed forces integration around innovation. Like we're trying to
Certainly.
work together so that we're not all inventing the cool new thing in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, because there are several Scotts, right, in each
Yeah,
branch of the
for
forces.
sure.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so I'm going to be selfish and talk about the stuff I love, okay,
Okay.
in bio. Because I mean, of course, there's fantastic discoveries being made in quantum systems. I don't understand that language at all. And in advanced materials development and debonding paints and all of that kind of stuff, which I hear and I'm like, wow, that's really cool. But what I love, of course, is living things, right? I love engineered biology. I love bioinspiration. And so the stuff, as we kind of mentioned, this is a heyday for biology, right? The last 10 years and hopefully the next 100 years will just be amazing for the technology developed that exploits living things rather than benefiting living things, it actually exploits it, right? So my favorite subject right now is engineered living materials, right? So I love this idea of rather than having dead materials, dead walls, dead clothes. How do you integrate living systems into that so that it's multifunctional, right? And there's been fantastic advances in that just within the last 10 years. And it's something that I'm always exploring when I'm on the road. It's like, tell me what you're doing in living materials. You can go and look at some of the programs that are being funded by DARPA and by the Air Force in the Build-A-Bricks, I believe is the name of the company coming out of the US, but it's all fungal biomaterials. And so
Huh.
taking waste materials and impregnating that with fungal spores that then grow and extend their little fingers, their hyphae into this material and make it as hard as concrete. And it's a fungus that's growing in sawdust, that's growing in sand, that's growing in a waste material and makes these incredibly durable bricks. I know NASA's invested in it as well because this is how we're going to colonize Mars or the moon, right? Is to
Wow.
repurpose our waste and to grow it out of fungi. There's a group here in the UK that's doing fantastic work in fungal biomaterials and in Germany as well. And I love this idea of taking something that's alive and taking something that's dead, that's a waste material, and then creating something new out of it, right? So you reduce chemical waste streams, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and you're using living materials that have the potential to self-heal, that through engineered biology could even be environmental sentinels, right? You could engineer the fungus to detect if there's a contaminant in the air that it needs to modulate and purify or clean out. So I love engineered living materials. There's a big push across Europe and in the US in developing this. Fantastic. I did some work, you mentioned it at the end, with the whole idea of the pathogen, the sentinel for pathogens. So researchers over the past couple of decades really started to explore how the microbes on our body, in our body, on the materials around us, just contribute to everything we know, right? And so, as we begin to explore and develop an understanding of these complex interplays between the microbes on us, and around us, we'll really see some fascinating technology. So, there was a DARPA program a few years ago to see if we could control the volatile organic compounds, right? It's a complex term for saying the bugs on your skin release small chemicals that act as attractants for mosquitoes and for insects. And so a lot of that is controlled by the microbes on your skin. And can you modulate that so that maybe you have a natural insect repellent, which is really cool? Can you do that to can change your skin profiles to clear up acne, to clear up eczema? These are all this symbiosis on your skin, in your gut, and the like. And so I think as we begin to understand, of course, this requires, as you said, similar to the iPhone, we're developing tools in the background that allow us to see the proteins, the small molecules, the interplays that happen at these tiny levels. As those tools develop, they're enabling our understanding of the very biology that makes us up. And then modulating those for different function is incredibly exciting. And so I hope to see a lot of that in the next couple of years. A lot of investment in that. One of the big investments that was signed by Biden last year the Defense Production Act and the executive order kind of inspiring or putting dollars behind bioproduction and biomanufacture in the US. So as tools have developed that allow us to engineer bacteria, fungi, mold to produce small molecules that are of interest to us, we recognize that we've been making beer for hundreds of years, which is fermentation. Can we not leverage fermentation to make other things that we need? Yeah. And so there's a lot of investment in that. So I think we'll see a lot of that in the future, which is incredibly exciting because that is what we call distributed manufacturing, right? There's a technical term for you. So instead of saying we make all of our plastics, cosmetics, and the like from oil products, and we have to set up those facilities close to refineries, close to shipping ports, close to these infrastructure centers. Synthetic biology and biotechnology is going to let you say, we have all of this corn waste material out here in Iowa or Idaho, which is cellulose, which is alcohols and the like. Let's build a biomanufacturing plant right next to that waste stream so that we can now make synthetic fuels, we can make synthetic polymers for clothing, and now you can make things everywhere. So biology is really going to open a lot of doors for us, and we're well underway with that. And it's a very exciting time. And those are the things that we invest in my portfolio that we're exploring. And I have partners, of course, in the other branches of the armed services. So yeah, stay by the TV. Keep
There you
reading
go.
science and tech and watch what's coming out because it's changing fast. It's
All
changing
right,
fast.
Scott, well, I'm going to put you on the hot seat and ask you for the three most important questions that we ask all of our guests here on the show.
Okay.
What is, in your mind, the greatest innovation in human history?
All right. So I'll pass on the easy one of electricity and harnessing that, right? Because
Okay.
where would we be without electricity?
Yes. What do you think? What could
Uh,
it be?
It'd be madness. I do think one of the bravest innovations slash discoveries, because with biology, it always walks the line. Is it a discovery? Is it an innovation? But we continue to see innovation in this space. But taking it back a couple of hundred years, Jenner, Pasteur in vaccine development, right? So this is harnessing biology to innovate with biology to create something new, right? So let's take something that exists, find a way to boost it, find a way for humans to leverage it. So I think that falls in the innovation space. But those early exploratory discoveries and innovations in vaccine development. I mean, think about it. If we didn't have vaccines for smallpox, for rabies, for all of those lovely things, for COVID, it definitely would have stifled us. I mean, the Dark Ages revolved around the bubonic plague, right? And how crippling worldwide pandemics could be. So I do think our understanding of vaccine development, I'm not a denier, vaccine development, have really allowed us to push forward societally and as a species, right? To resist disease. It's a great innovation. And it continues to be developed, right? The COVID vaccine and mRNA-based vaccines and DNA and RNA vaccines that are coming down the pipeline. Amazing innovations. Really
Amazing.
good. Thanks,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anthony Bourdain would have said the Malaysian pork chop sandwich, but that's okay.
So I could get behind that too.
I can
Okay.
get behind that.
I never begrudge a pork chop sandwich.
Who would? Who would? So my other question is, if you could join any innovation team in human history, which would you join and why?
Okay. So this is an easy one for me because again, engineered biology and I love to tinker with DNA and proteins and just make something happen. So for me, the one I always cite as one of the greatest innovations in team developments was Herbert Boyer. Yeah. So humalin development in E. coli, right? First example of re-engineering an organism to make something useful for society. Probably one of my favorite GMOs, right? So they took a genetic circuit to make insulin, which was historically made in what? Pig pancreases, right? Very limiting. And they said, I think we can do this in a microbe and we can grow it in a big vat and we can make a ton of it. And so they took the genes necessary to make human insulin, they put it in a bacteria. I mean, it's not this simple, but then they grew it in a big fermenter, extracted the insulin, and now you have human insulin made in a bacteria grown in a fermenter, mass produced for the masses. And so that was a fantastic innovation. And to be in that lab and to be tinkering around with the genetic circuits and the export machinery to make that happen must have been amazing.
Must have
And
been.
yeah.
And
So
my last
that's
question,
probably my favorite.
what would you like to see invented that drives you crazy or that would just bring more goodwill, let's say, to the world? What would you love to see innovated that has not yet happened?
So it's getting close. But my favorite that we have to address, right? So I'm a big bioremediation, circular bioeconomy guy. It's what keeps me up at night. So you're guilty. I'm guilty. This needs to go away. The
Plastic?
plastic.
Yeah.
So there have been some great strides in making enzymatic systems, biology again. Biology will save us all. Biological systems to break down plastic. But the investment really needs to get behind that. And the scientists out there are really working to develop the tools because we've made some pretty nasty polymers as a species that are really hard to get rid of. But fortunately for us, for everything nasty we make, biology says, hey, I can eat that.
I could
Uh,
eat that. That's right. I could decompose that
I can
with no
decompose
much.
that and I'll use that for something. And so plastic is a huge issue. I mean, I like to scuba dive. I love to be in the ocean, and it always just pains me to be underwater and say, "Oh, look at that plastic bottle. Look at that ring. Look at that piece of I don't even know what it is, but I know it's plastic, and why is it in my ocean?"
Yeah.
And so it drives me crazy. And we're never going to get away from using plastics. There's too many of us, right? We
But
can't make.
we might find like corn-based materials, right? I mean,
Oh, for
Coca-Cola is
sure,
experimenting with
for
biodegradable
sure.
bottles at this
Yes.
point.
Oh no. I have been to some fantastic facilities around Europe where they are taking waste streams and they're making nice little baggies that are made out of potato starches and waste materials from this and that's spun into a plastic bag equivalent, but it's made out of starch and it degrades under these signals. And I hear lots of great proposals that I'm trying to fund about people saying, well, I have this repurposed protein material that I can spin into a baggie for food storage. Love those products.
Yeah.
Definitely where we need to go. We need to get away from single use culture and get into this circular bioeconomy. So that's the thing that drives me crazy. Quit throwing your trash out, people. Recognize that all of these plastic bottles are absolutely terrible. And
Amen.
let's
Scott, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. If people want to get in touch with you, have some amazing biology-based ideas they want to throw at you, Scott, where's the best place to reach you?
oh, definitely, Susan. So reach out to me on LinkedIn, ONR. So the Office of Naval Research, ONR Global, they have digital presences on LinkedIn and on the various social media platforms, you can always track and see some of the great science and technology we're investing in. Believe me when I say that the Navy is not all missiles, rockets, and planes. I mean, that's what people think of. It's really cool, but there's a lot of great science going on behind the scenes. Do reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always fairly responsive there. Also, keep in mind that I do synthetic biology, but as I mentioned in the beginning, the Navy does everything. So if you're working in quantum, if you're working in materials, if you're working in missiles and bullets, I definitely know someone that I can connect you to. The Navy wants to hear about what you're doing. So reach out to me and I'll put you in touch with the right person.
Fantastic. Scott, thank you so much. Have a fantastic new year and a happy holiday.
You too, Susan.
Thank
And eat lots of good food. Enjoy it.
you.
But thank you very much for the opportunity.
My pleasure.